Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Michael Kessler, the Executive Director of the Berkeley Center and a faculty member in the Government Department. On behalf of my colleagues in the Berkeley Center, I'd like to welcome you to this conference, Carrying Forward Drew Christensen's Legacy, Catholic Social Teaching, Environmental Justice, Just War, and Peace Building. When our colleague Drew Christensen passed away, we lost not only a beloved friend, but a scholar whose capacious mind, gentle spirit, and sheer range of expertise are demonstrated by the many scholars and experts and friends gathered here from a range of institutions. This conference celebrates Drew's many accomplishments across these networks that he was involved in and assesses the challenges that lie ahead for the work of his many close partners who carry on this important work. You'll hear from many of these partners over the next 2 days, and I note the remarkable number of institutions and groups who are co-sponsors of this event. 2 of these partners I want to specifically thank at the beginning of this conference. Professor Marianne Cusimano-Love of Catholic University of America and Professor Jerry Powers of the University of Notre Dame initiated the idea of a conference simultaneous to discussion among Berkeley Center faculty for a conference. And we thought, how much better to honor Drew's legacy than to work together? At the same time, a number of Drew's friends and colleagues in what I call the nuclear world had also reached out to us to ask about plans for a conference, and we invited them to collaborate, which is why we have such a sheer, wonderful range that reflects Drew's life's work. It was my absolute pleasure to work with all of these, especially with Marianne and with Jerry, and the uniting of these 3 great Catholic institutions. Thank you for your collaboration. It is now my pleasure to welcome President John DeGioia, the 48th president of Georgetown University, who will offer words of introduction, and he will be followed by Professor David Hollenbach, who will give the keynote, our Pedro Arrupe Distinguished Research Professor. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, thank you very much, Michael. And thanks for all the great efforts in putting together this wonderful tribute to our dear friend. And I want to thank you all for your presence here today at this special convening as we gather to honor the memory, legacy, and work of our dear friend and colleague, Father Drew Christensen. And we're grateful to have all of you here, a colleague, mentor, friend, a spiritual guide, a dedicated Jesuit, an advocate for the most vulnerable. We celebrate the life of a man who meant so much to all of us, a man who made so many important contributions to building a more just and peaceful world. And I do want to offer my appreciation to our colleagues at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs for providing such a rich forum to engage the ideas that animated Drew's life and work. We're honored by the many partners who have supported us for this convening, a testament to the impact of Drew and the importance of these themes for study, dialogue, and action. And it's a privilege to have so many of his dear colleagues and friends here to participate. I simply cannot imagine a more fitting and appropriate way, a better way to remember him than with this convening. Over the course of these 2 days, we'll focus on the issues that meant so much to him: peace building and interreligious engagement, just war and nonviolence, nuclear arms control and disarmament, and environmental justice. Drew devoted his life to the study of the Catholic Church and its teachings on ethics. He was an impactful voice on issues of human rights and international relations. He had a special focus on peace in the Holy Land, Muslim-Christian dialogue, disarmament, and the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and the rights of workers. A consultant to the Holy See, a member of the steering committee of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, Drew also served as director of the Office of International Justice and Peace of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and as editor-in-chief of the Jesuit publication America. He joined our community here at Georgetown in 2014 as a distinguished professor of ethics and human development in our School of Foreign Service and as senior fellow at the Berkeley Center. It was a privilege to share our life here on this hilltop with him, to benefit from his faith, his service, his scholarship, and his compassion for our world. Drew was the best of us. Our world is more just, and our global community has greater vision of peace because of him. And with this gathering, we look to carry forth his legacy of engagement on these issues of importance in our world. After this convening, I hope you'll also join us on Wednesday evening for our inaugural Drew Christensen Memorial Lecture to be offered by Sami El-Youssef, the Chief Executive Officer of the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem, on the presence of the Church in the Holy Land. This gathering is a wonderful tribute to our friend and colleague who cared so deeply about our world. And to begin, we are honored to have with us Drew's longtime friend, Father David Hollenbach, who serves as our Pedro Arrupe Distinguished Research Professor in our School of Foreign Service, as a senior fellow of the Berkeley Center, and as a member of our faculty in our Department of Theology. And it's an honor for me to turn this podium over to David. David?
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate that very much. Thank you so much, President Gioia, and thanks to all of you for being here and for giving me the opportunity to kick off our reflections and remembrance of Drew Christensen. It's a great privilege for me to be able to do that. I know that Drew's work helped make our world both more peaceful and less marred by injustice. His voice on issues of social ethics and on the role of Christianity in society was very important over the past several decades. His contributions covered such an array of issues that it's almost impossible for me to mention more than a few of them in this kickoff talk. I hope my words will help each of us recall some of the ways that he made a real difference in the areas that we're most concerned about. My gratefulness in being asked to share my reflections this afternoon is particularly deep because, as President DeGioia mentioned, Drew and I have been close friends for a long time, actually for over 50 years. I first came to know Drew when we began our studies of theology together at Woodstock College back in 1969. At Woodstock, Drew and I, along with several other young Jesuits, worked under the mentorship of the distinguished theologian Avery Dulles in an innovative program that explored the implications of the theology we were studying for our social and political life. Doing that with the Dulles was an interesting reality. Thus, it was not surprising that we were working together due to the fact that we were working on this, that Drew decided to move forward in his further studies in social ethics. So after our ordinations, Drew's and mine, as priests, we ended up together again at Yale University, where we both studied for the PhD in religious ethics. Our shared desire to understand the practical and policy implications of our academic work came to the fore in an article we published jointly as graduate students that sought to clarify how the Catholic Church could make a positive contribution to the United Nations World Population Conference that was being held in Bucharest all the way back in 1974. Given the controversies concerning the official Catholic teaching on birth control This effort showed that Drew did not hesitate to become engaged in disputed issues. Drew's work at Yale also showed his strongly pastoral concern. His dissertation was on the deeply humanistic and deeply pastoral concern of how we should care for the elderly in our society. He argued that the reigning U.S. commitment to respect for autonomy as the central concern in ethics could limit and, in fact, undermine our commitment to those whose autonomous freedom was being diminished by aging. Following his graduate studies, Drew launched into work that took him to academic institutions such as the Woodstock Theological Center here at Georgetown, the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, California, affiliated with Cal Berkeley, the University of Notre Dame. In those settings, he taught his students with great devotion and pursued creative research. He subsequently moved into important work outside of academia in church agencies such as the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he led the Office of International Justice and Peace, collaborating with John Carr, who's here amongst us this afternoon, and also to the editorship of the Jesuit-sponsored journal America. He was editor-in-chief there from 2005 to 2012. Following his editorship at America, he returned here to Georgetown as senior fellow at the Berkeley Center and as distinguished professor of ethics and human development in the Walsh School of Foreign Service. His final contribution to peace building was written here at Georgetown, appearing just a couple of days before his death. The lengthy title of that article shows the continuing importance of Drew's work for us today. That article was titled, "We have a moral duty to protect Ukrainian civilians, but that does not mean going to war with Russia." Christensen's peacemaking work flowed both from deep intellectual interests and also from his ministry as a Catholic priest and Jesuit. His many contributions reflected the vision of the Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, which declared, quote, "the joys and hopes, griefs and anxieties of the people of our age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts." The Council's affirmation that both human achievements and human struggles are central concerns of the Christian community was echoed in the Jesuit Order's declaration in 1975 in its 32nd General Congregation that the mission of the Society of Jesus today is the service of faith, of which the promotion of justice is an absolute requirement. For reconciliation, the Jesuit congregation continued, reconciliation with God demands reconciliation of people with each other. These commitments by the Council and by the Jesuits led Drew to bring his theological and ethical expertise to bear on a wide range of social issues. For example, his work with the U.S. bishops what led him to supervise the drafting of the bishop's pastoral letter on Catholic social teaching and the environment, entitled Renewing the Earth. And as a result of that work, he co-edited with Walt Grazier, who's here among us, a volume published by the Bishops' Conference titled, "And God Saw That It Was Good, Catholic Theology and the Environment." Drew's love of the outdoors surely contributed to his work on environmental issues. His care for nature and love of nature was evident from the fact that he often made his week-long Jesuit retreat camping with several fellow Jesuits in the mountains of California. Drew's work on the environment anticipated both the Jesuits' 35th General Congregation's declaration that reconciliation with creation is a central goal of Jesuit ministry, and it anticipated Pope Francis's powerful call in his encyclical Laudato Si to care for the earth as our common home. Another area of concern affirmed by the Council and central to the Jesuit ministry that engaged Drew deeply was the need for reconciliation among diverse religious communities. The Jesuits' 34th General Congregation called Jesuits to help, quote, develop a culture of dialogue in our approach to believers of other religions, end quote. This call has been deepened in Pope Francis's recent insistence in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti that a culture of encounter is essential to the peace of the world, and that justice between religious communities is required for this peace. Drew's commitment to dialogue was powerfully evident in his work concerning the Middle East. For example, he had participated in the Atlantic Council's Middle East Strategy Task Force on religion, identity, and countering violent extremism. And he also served on the Leadership Council of the ecumenical organization Churches for Middle East Peace. Drew Christensen knew well that Christians have been on the receiving end of violence in many locations in the Middle East, and that interreligious understanding is essential to justice and peace for Middle East Christians. Perhaps the most important contribution of Drew Christensen to peace building has been his effort to rethink the ethics of war and peace from a theological perspective in recent years. Much of his recent work was devoted to rethinking the Catholic tradition's understanding of whether the promotion of justice might sometimes justify the use of armed force to defend innocent people from serious threats, or whether Christians are called to make a commitment to nonviolence. Now, there has been a very lively debate in recent years about whether the Catholic Church should continue its commitment to the just war tradition or should take a firm stand in favor of nonviolence. Some hold today that non-participation of Christians in military activities in the earliest period of church history remains or should remain normative today. They argue that the legitimation of Christian participation in the military in the post-Constantinian era was a kind of co-optation of the church by the ruling powers, and as a result, a kind of betrayal of the gospel. This leads them to endorse nonviolence as the only legitimate Christian option. In this vein, a conference held in Rome under the sponsorship of the Catholic peace group Pax Christi just a few years ago, argued that the just war tradition, long held by Catholicism, should be replaced with a firm commitment to nonviolence. This conference's concluding document stated, quote, "The time has come for our church to be a living witness and to invest far greater human and financial resources in promoting a spirituality and practice of active nonviolence and informing and training our Catholic communities in effective nonviolent practices. In all of this, Jesus should be our inspiration and model." Indeed, the conference went on to state, quote, "We believe there is no just war. Suggesting that a just war is possible undermines the moral imperative to develop tools and capacities for nonviolent transformation of conflict. We need a new framework, the conference stated, that is consistent with gospel nonviolence. Now, some recent papal teachings also suggest that the Catholic Church is moving in this direction, away from just war tradition and deepening its commitment to nonviolence. Pope Francis is surely a strong advocate of nonviolence as the appropriate response to injustice, and on a number of occasions he has questioned the adequacy of the way that the just war tradition has been employed. Very recently, in his encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis declared that, quote, "We can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war." End of quote from Pope Francis. Pope Francis echoed this stance in his recent conversation with Patriarch Kirill of Moscow concerning the war in Ukraine, when Pope Francis stated, quote, "There was a time, even in our churches, when people spoke of a holy war or a just war. Today, we cannot speak in this manner," end of quote. Indeed, in his 2017 World Day of Peace message entitled Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace, Pope Francis strongly endorsed nonviolence as the way to grapple with issues arising in international settings. In the Pope's words, quote, "May nonviolence become the hallmark of our decisions, our relationships, and our actions, and indeed of political life in all its forms," end quote. In these statements, Pope Francis is echoing statements of several of his recent predecessors. For example, Pope John Paul II appeared to reject the legitimacy of the use of force shortly after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Pope John Paul II stated that the true path of peace, quote, "never passes through violence and always through dialogue. Everyone knows, and particularly those who come from the countries that hostilities are bathing in blood, that violence always spawns more violence," end of quote. Pope John Paul II declared, therefore, that war, quote, "must always be considered a defeat of reason and a defeat of humanity. Thus, may there soon be a spiritual and cultural impulse that will induce people to ban war," end quote. Papal statements like these from Pope Francis and Pope John Paul II suggest that the Catholic leadership is moving toward the adoption of a firm commitment to nonviolence and an abandonment of the just war tradition. Now, such a move, if it is in fact occurring, has been rejected by a number of commentators, both within and outside the Catholic community. For example, Mark Allman and Tobias Widnright maintain that the statement resulting from the Pax Christi Conference in Rome reads Scripture, Catholic tradition, and recent church teachings selectively, that it fails to give sufficient attention to cases where force is needed for legitimate defense, and that it draws a mistaken dichotomy between a commitment to nonviolence and the just war tradition's recognition that force can regrettably sometimes be morally legitimate. In the same vein, James Turner Johnson, a distinguished historian of the just war tradition, has asked, quote, "Is the Catholic Church about to abandon the just war tradition?" and Johnson's answer to his own question clearly indicates that he thinks that such an abandonment would be a serious mistake. Now, despite Pope Francis's strong suggestions that war can no longer be justified today, the Pope has also indicated that his position does not seem to be an absolute. Most tellingly, in a press conference during the flight returning from his recent trip to Kazakhstan, when Pope Francis was asked whether Ukraine should be given weapons to defend itself, he replied affirmatively. In Pope Francis's words, quote, "This is a political decision which can be moral, morally acceptable if it is done according to the conditions of morality. To defend oneself is not only lawful, but also can be an expression of love, love of one's neighbor, and love of one's country." End of quote. It seems, therefore, when Pope Francis speaks here of the conditions of morality, he is referring to the conditions of the just war tradition. Indeed, he went on in the press conference in that plane returning from Kazakhstan to suggest that we need to, quote, "think more about the concept of just war," end of quote. I take this to mean that we need to think more carefully about how to understand and apply the norms for legitimate use of force traditionally proposed in the just war tradition. Now, in Drew Christensen's judgment, and in mine as well, Pope Francis is not calling for an abandonment of the just war tradition, but rather calling us to recognize the immense destructiveness of war and to have a very deep reluctance to resort to force. Francis is advocating an interpretation of the just war norms that is so stringent that many, if not most, of today's conflicts would not be justified, and indeed ought never to have been launched. But he is not, in my judgment, rejecting the exceptional use of force when it is necessary to defend innocent people, as he has implied may be the case in Ukraine. Thus, Pope Francis's teaching on the ethics of war is close to what was said by the U.S. Catholic bishops in their 1993 statement, quote, called "The Harvest of Justice is Sown in Peace," which was issued on the 10th anniversary of their earlier pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace. This statement, "The harvest of justice is sown in peace," is surely relevant to our remembrance of the work of Drew Christensen, for Drew played a leading role as head of the Office of International Justice and Peace at the Bishops' Conference in drafting this very statement. Especially related to our considerations about peace building and peacemaking is the statement's insistence that the moral assessment of conflict should begin from a recognition of, quote, "the terrible human and moral costs of violence," end of quote. Such recognition leads the bishops to insist that standing up to protect human life wherever it is threatened is the starting point of genuine peace building. This recognition, as well as the bishop's attention to Jesus' call to Christians to be peacemakers, leads to strong support for nonviolence in a Christian ethic, according to the U.S. bishops. Indeed, it leads the U.S. bishops and Pope Francis as well to suggest that commitment to nonviolence should be where Christians begin when they seek to defend innocent people against grave injustice. As the bishops put it, likely with Drew Christensen's help, quote, "In situations of conflict, our constant commitment ought to be, as far as possible, to strive for justice through nonviolent means. But when sustained attempts at nonviolent action fail to protect the innocent against injustice, then legitimate political authorities are permitted, as a last resort, to employ limited force to rescue the innocent and establish justice, end quote. Thus, the U.S. bishops and Pope Francis himself both, I think, see nonviolence as a central commitment in the Christian approach to international affairs. But the U.S. bishops and Pope Francis as well recognize that the world is marred by human sinfulness and that this can lead to conflict. Therefore, the strictly limited use of force may sometimes be necessary if it is for a just cause, if it is carried out with the right intention, by proportionate means, with probability of success, and as a last resort. One can read Pope Francis's treatment of war in just this way. Only when nonviolent means of achieving justice have been exhausted does Pope Francis permit overriding the presumption against force by seeking peace that protects human dignity and human rights, as the Pope has suggested is the case in Ukraine. Now, some recent authors, such as the man I mentioned earlier, James Turner Johnson, the distinguished scholar of the history of just war tradition, have argued that this stress on nonviolent approaches to injustice in papal and episcopal teaching is really, in effect, an abandonment of the just war tradition. Johnson holds that the Catholic tradition makes a presumption in favor of justice, even by the use of force, rather than a presumption in favor of nonviolence, as the U.S. bishops, with Drew Christensen's help, argued. I think, however, that Johnson's argument about how to interpret the just war tradition is incorrect. St. Thomas Aquinas develops his treatment of the ethics of peace and war in response to the question of, quote, whether it is always a sin to fight in war. The question that Aquinas asks in Latin is, utrum bellare semper sit peccatum. Is it always sinful to fight in war? To ask if war is always sinful is surely to presuppose that war is to be avoided if at all possible. Indeed, Johnson himself, James Turner Johnson, recognized this in an argument he wrote, in an article he wrote back in 1979. There, Johnson said that Aquinas' original just war question suggests, quote, the somewhat startling discovery that pacifist and just war Christians have something profoundly in common, namely a searching distrust of violence. End of quote from James Turner Johnson. Regrettably, Johnson seems in his recent writings to have forgotten his earlier view, in which he advocates, interprets Aquinas to mean that presupposition is against the use of force. He seems to have moved away from his earlier position. Now, Drew Christensen himself certainly held that nonviolence and the just war tradition have a complementary relationship to each other. Indeed, Drew argued that a commitment to nonviolence strengthens the impact of the just war tradition in several ways. First, the presupposition for a nonviolent response to injustice strengthens the rigor with which the just war norm of last resort should be applied. Secondly, a presupposition in support of nonviolence was evident, Drew argued, when the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty first articulated the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. Drew stressed that the Commission's so-called precautionary principles stressed that force should be used to resist crimes against humanity, like genocide, and only after diplomacy and other non-military means have been exhausted. Finally, Drew Christensen stressed that the commitment to nonviolence should strengthen the so-called post-bellum norms that call us to, in the aftermath of conflict, post-bellum, after conflict, to pursue reconciliation through reconstruction and even forgiveness. Drew's reflections thus show that the commitment to nonviolence can strengthen some of these key components of the development of just war tradition today, and have much to contribute to the political situation that we face today, and should not be considered unrealistic, this commitment to nonviolence and its importance. The same can be said of Drew Christensen's strong support of Pope Francis's recent insistence that not only is the use of nuclear weapons morally unacceptable, but their very possession must be morally rejected as well. Drew worked closely with the Holy See on matters of disarmament, leading to 2 recent books that he co-edited. He served as an expert advisor to the delegation of the Holy See that participated in negotiating the United Nations 2017 treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And he also worked with the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and with distinguished foreign policy leaders who are working to abolish nuclear weapons today. Pope Francis's teaching that the very possession of nuclear weapons is morally unacceptable raises a very important question, namely, whether Pope Francis means that nuclear-armed nations must disarm from these weapons immediately, perhaps even unilaterally, independent of the political consequences of such a step. This was a position advocated some 25 years ago by John Finnis, Joseph Boyle, and Germaine Grisey in a book they wrote on deterrence and nuclear weapons. And they advocated this need for immediate, even unilateral disarmament, even if the consequences were to be a major attack on the West that could lead to the end of Western civilization. They went so far as to state that. Christensen argues that Pope Francis does not draw this kind of conclusion from his statement that nuclear weapons possession is morally unacceptable. In Christensen's view, the position of Finnis and his co-authors results from an older, somewhat legalistic model of moral theology which Pope Francis has replaced with, quote, a less narrow, non-apodictic style of moral deliberation that is built on discernment of which alternative courses of action are likely to lead to better outcomes. Now, in my view, and I believe in Drew Christensen's as well, the Pope's stance rejecting the very possession of nuclear weapons seeks to strengthen the judgment that the continuing possession of nuclear weapons, including for deterrence, runs an unacceptably high risk of bringing serious harm to humanity and is thus morally unacceptable. But the Pope's stand also recognizes that we need to discern prudent ways to move effectively toward the abolition of these weapons. This calls us to recognize that the nuclear threat, like the danger of war more generally, is embedded in the larger social system that shapes the likelihood of conflict. The abolition of nuclear weapons thus calls for a range of social and political steps that will lead nations to become less convinced that they need these weapons for self-defense. The abolition of nuclear arms, therefore, is closely linked with broader forms of social transformation that are needed for peace building. This linkage has been called integral disarmament by both Pope John the 23rd and by Pope Francis. Jared Powers, who's here with us, has argued that this approach, quote, assumes that the long-term goal of abolishing nuclear weapons has to be part of a much larger cosmopolitan project of developing a global ethic of peace and solidarity that can ground a system of cooperative security, end of quote. Such an approach to nuclear disarmament calls for a broad range of steps that one hopes will lead to the gradual transformation of the social and economic and political conditions of our world. Nuclear disarmament, like peace building in its full range, is a multi-dimensional challenge. It calls for initiatives that both reduce the danger of war and that move societies to the greater justice needed to enhance the prospects for peace. Undertaking the steps needed to build the peace in this way will require a considerable amount of hope. Drew Christensen always brought hope to his work, so we can learn from him on this matter as well. For Drew, hope was not a simple optimism. It was rather deeply rooted in his faith as a Christian. As he wrote in an essay on Jewish-Christian relations, to address the challenge of peace in our time, we need more than an adequate ethics. Even more importantly, we need to grow in our living relationship to God and to, quote, the depths of divine compassion. I am sure that Drew Christensen's appreciation of that divine compassion was what kept his hope for peace building alive in our time. Thank you. What is our procedure now, Michael?
Would you like to take some questions or have open conversation?
How are we doing on time? Well, I would prefer to have other people make their comments about ways that Drew contributed to what they see as peace building and greater justice, and I'm certainly ready to respond to questions, but I'd love to hear more from you. I've reflected on my memories of Drew. Maybe you could share some of your memories of Drew as well. Please feel free. Yes, over here.
I had the privilege of being participating in the negotiations on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and I want to recognize Pierce Corden here, who was with the delegation. And I worked with Drew in trying to get language in the treaty on the morality of nuclear weapons. And we had a lot of momentum, but to our surprise, there was an enormous pushback on that. There were countries who were unwilling to take a moral position on nuclear weapons, although as a practical and humanitarian matter and as a legal matter, they were willing to adopt the treaty to abolish them, but they weren't willing to take a moral position. And I believe very strongly that that's the secret sauce that's missing in our efforts. That the moral position comes from the Spirit, the moral position comes from the deepest wisdom of humanity. The moral position is the compass point that's necessary to give power to change. And that was not in the treaty, and Drew did his best to get it in the treaty. And I think that's part of our task today, to keep his legacy of keeping the power of moral insight, moral persuasion that's grounded in compassion and love alive.
Thank you very much. That's really powerful, and it's the resistance to that may be a result of the fact that people think of moral position as being moralistic, somehow being removed from the reality of what's going on in our world. But in fact, I think the way Drew would approach this, and the way I think the Catholic community would approach it, would be to say, morality means, are you responding to the needs of human beings, human dignity, human worth? And morality is not some extrinsic view, it's intrinsic to being human. And I think that may be the way in which one would help try to move in a different direction there, by helping people see that. Other observations are for ways that Drew contributed on all these issues. Yes.
I'm Steve Kolecki, and I was one of his successors at the Bishops' Conference in the International Justice and Peace Office. And one of the things that I learned deeply, deeply from Drew was to listen to the narratives of people on the ground. And the narratives that he particularly exposed me to related to the conflict in the Holy Land between Israelis and Palestinians. And that narrative is very skewed in our American culture in a way that, one side is characterized as terrorists, the other side is characterized as oppressed. But when you get underneath to the real narratives of Jewish people who really seek a secure and peaceful Israel, and many of them want to live in peace with their Palestinian neighbors, and they want self-determination in a state for the Palestinian people. Now, right now, politically, they're in a minority. But the insight I wanted to share was that Drew encouraged me to travel to the Holy Land often. When I took over responsibilities from him, that he had been our lead person on the Holy Land when I first came to the office. And working with John Carr, we went there often, and that was important, particularly to listen to the voice of the church there. It's very atypical of what people think of in terms of what the church is actually experiencing there, and how, in many ways, they're in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, because they are Palestinian themselves, and they want self-determination for the Palestinian people, and they want to live in peace with a recognized and secure Israel. And so that's perhaps the most complicated conflict I worked on in the office, I thought. And his key to it was to listen to the local church, listen to the local people, be in dialogue with Jewish people, Muslim people, Christian people, be in dialogue with both Israelis and Palestinians. And that's what I learned from Drew.
His contributions to interreligious understanding undoubtedly comes from that same commitment to listening, and not just reading library books, but actually connecting. Yes, lady over here.
Hi, I'm Carol Sargent, and I was Father Christensen's co-editor on 2 books. He was by far the lead editor. But one of the things I noted, Father Hollenbach mentioned his dissertation at Yale. It is so important to notice that his director was a woman. It was Sister Margaret Farley. He was able to accept women's cooperation, women's leadership. He worked with women in a way that I have found not just few men, but few women are able to do, right? And that if we're going to think about a world free of nuclear weapons, we must consider the leadership of women.
Thank you. Very important point. Other observations or concerns that people would like to share about Drew's contributions? I'm sure there's plenty more to be said in the panels that are coming up, but anybody right now like to say anything in addition? Yes, right up here in the front, or go right ahead.
So I was one of Father Drew's students I was actually in a thesis with him. He was supervising my thesis when he passed away. And one of the last letters he actually sent to me was about this idea of irrationality and whether we're heading towards an irrational world. And I thought that he had a very interesting sense of, how we're going to control for rationality and how our experience with the world. One of his favorite books was this wonderful book called Plato and the Googleplex. I see a few people laughing because I bet he talked about that a lot. But this idea of like, even if he didn't grow up with technology and the digital revolution, he had a sense of what it was, and I think that speaks to his. I was wondering if you could speak to his like broad, how he dealt with so many issues, and how he unified that under kind of one grand theory, or if you thought he had a grand theory or not.
I'm not entirely sure. Ron, do you want to comment on that?
I think you're right on. I think you're right on. We talked always about his great love for Greek tragedy. And he thought that the Greeks taught us humanity, and if they did anything, they helped correct our Christianity of the day. And that his example was always, we divide the world into right and wrong, and the Greeks divided into tragic and comic. And he said his solution, in a way, was in between the black and the white, the wrong and right, there is an enormous gray area. And that's where tragedy is. And so, in a way, his approach even to Ukraine would be, there's going to be a gigantic tragedy. It may be right, it may be wrong, we should help, we should not help. It doesn't matter, the Greeks are right. There's going to be a great tragedy, as he might say, because Oedipus doesn't know himself. He doesn't know who he is. And yet he wants to act correctly and well. So Sophocles is another big influence with Drew. He loved the classics because they said so much to the world that we're usually not familiar with, the in-between, the right and the wrong world where we have to live. So anyway, thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. Jerry Powers, you wanted to comment on something.
I just wanted to note one issue that Drew spent a lot of time on, but would have liked to spend more time on, I think, and that is sustainable development. And I think his early work on population issues with you when he was at Yale was part of that. But one of the first articles that I found very helpful to me was an article he wrote on relative equality. And this would be very relevant for the discussions about economic inequality today in the world. But he had very interesting views on development ethics that I always found really helpful. And we didn't include that in this conference except through the environment panel. But I think that was an area he wished he would have had more time to work on had he not spent so much time working on nuclear disarmament and peace issues and some other issues.
No, that article on relative equality, I remember when he was writing that, he wrote it right in one of these buildings that we're joining next to right here, but it was a contribution to a project that we had here at Georgetown at the Woodstock Theological Center on human rights in the Americas. And it was basically trying to identify what the human rights agenda for the U.S. ought to be vis-a-vis Latin America. And of course, there was a lot of talk at the time about the need for democracy in Latin America because in those days there was all kinds of military dictatorship over in various parts of Latin America. The Pinochet was in Chile, and the Brazilians were under military rule, and the Argentinians were facing the dirty war and all that. And so there was a lot of military and political restriction in Latin America. But Drew also wanted to argue that we should not overlook the serious economic roots of some of these conflicts that show up politically and militarily. And that as a result of that, he wrote this article on relative inequality. It was on inequality, really, but it was on bringing the notion of equality to the fore in our discussions of economics. That issue is by no means dead. It's actually just as important today as it was when Drew wrote that issue, it seems to me, when we look around the world and see the levels of inequality that have been growing and how those are contributing to the rise of populism and how populism is contributing to greater tensions and conflicts. And so the need for addressing these deep issues of inequality, it seems to me, are absolutely essential to the advancement of peace. And I would surely share that view with Drew, and I would love to have him here to say more about it right now. John, you want to comment on that? John Carr?
This is the USCCB Alumni Association.
Right,
apparently.
it's great.
Drew, in my experience, you can imagine trying to be Drew Christensen's supervisor. It was a joy, but it also was a challenge. Drew was a man of big ideas, but he was not an ideologue. He believed these principles needed to be tested by experience. As Steve said, by the experience of ordinary people, but also by the experience of reality. And he had a sense that we spent too much time in our own corners. And we would dismiss the arguments of others. We would ridicule the arguments of others. We would not take seriously. So on the question of war and peace, there are lots of people these days who say Ukraine is a preeminent example of where the use of force might be justified as a matter of defense. And they say that proves that. These are the same people who do not confront the way in which those principles were misused to justify an unjust war in Iraq. And you can reverse that. There are those of us who are eloquent about how the framework of just war has been misused to do evil, but aren't really comfortable dealing with the hard challenges of when a brutal nation invades another brutal nation and what can be done. So, and the same thing on nuclear deterrence, that rather than just say he lives in the gray area, as Father said, and so he was so smart, but he also was connected, and I think both those things were really important.
Yes, John Borelli.
Keeping with the theme of the alumni gathering, you were effective as a supervisor, John, because you said to Drew no, and he just said to me one evening on the way out the door, "Oh, I gave your name to the White House after your statement with Muslims." I was speaking to Al Gore the next day at my desk before the UN Population Conference in Cairo. So you were effective, but Drew got around you. I don't want to comment on interreligious understanding. That's for those who will get up early tomorrow for our panel. But I do want to talk about what I think was really bothering Drew in these final months when he could reflect on this. It's good what we've said about morality and the moral collaboration, moral persuasion that we can build, which is the important ingredient for nuclear disarmament. But he was quite worried about leaders in positions of power, of great power, who were simply amoral, who did not seem to have a moral compass. Now, you can see in some ways Pope Francis mentioned this about Ukraine, about NATO baiting Putin, and see some reasons for Russian reflection. But when you have moral leaders who don't seem to have a moral compass, what do you do? And I think he would probably be reflecting on that. Now, maybe the political climate is turning against that, but if you have one in a huge position of power, that's going to encourage others. So what do we do about that? I don't know where he would come down. I think he would still be perplexed about it.
I could just add one comment on that, and that would be that I think that one of Drew's deep commitments to the role of the church in this area was because he was convinced that taking Christian beliefs seriously could energize people and energize a community to make a difference in approaching these larger public policy issues, so that building up the resources of civil society through the contributions of the church itself to civil society, which would in turn have an influence on government and policymakers. I think he would probably want to go that direction, in which he would want to see the ways in which Christian faith could make a real difference in this area. Marianne Cusimano-Love up here in front.
Thank you, David, for your lovely remarks here today, kind of framing his academic work and his advocacy work in his personal journey. I wonder if you could say a few words about Jesuit discernment and how that influenced the ways that Drew approached these issues. As you know, he was definitely a son of Vatican II and very engaged with reading the signs of the times. And he believed that if you were taking Christian just war and nonviolence traditions and trying to hold these in tension, the way that you moved beyond that being a zero-sum game and toward it being a more robust position of peace building, of just peace, which is where he came down. He said you did that by taking seriously the signs of the times, taking seriously dialogue with other religious traditions. We'll hear more about that tomorrow. Dialogue with people we've heard in areas of conflict, but that we are capable of moral learning, and that we are capable of finding the spirit in other sources than some of the traditional sources. And to me, I think his trust in Vatican II reading of the signs of the times either came from or deeply paralleled Jesuit discernment, and I wonder if you had some thoughts on that, how Jesuit discernment and the signs of the time informed his work.
Well, I mean, the Jesuit discernment process this comes from St. Ignatius Loyola, and you could find strong references to it in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius and so forth. But one of the things that it's rooted in is how a person in his or her full personhood gets immersed in the story of Jesus. How that the reality of who Jesus is and who God is and what this divine compassion is all about, that Drew made the reference to, and I quoted him at the end. This is not just an idea. This is not just something you would learn about by reading in a library. It's something that shapes the person, shapes the person's affectivity, shapes the person's ideas for sure, but also shapes the person's affectivity. And therefore, when one engages in a situation like a particular conflict, for me, one of the most important situations was what happened to me when I went to Rwanda in the immediate aftermath of the genocide. And the affectivity, what I felt when I was there, and how I'm strongly opposed to the death penalty. But when I was walking around and seeing unburied corpses, I was saying to myself, maybe I should reconsider my views on the death penalty. Maybe the people who did this should be put to death. But the more I stayed with it, and the more I allowed the story of what it is to be Christian and the reality of the struggles of the people, the more I allowed that it shaped me to move in a new direction. It was a combination of ideas and affectivity and feeling, and it had a spiritual dimension to it in a very real way. I think that's part of what the discernment process is about. The discernment process from an Ignatian or a Jesuit point of view is not simply an intellectual process. It's partially affective, and that affectivity is genuinely spiritual. And I think that that's part of what enabled Drew to keep his hope alive. I mean, he looked around the world and he saw there's a lot of problems in the world today, and it's not easy to get pretty discouraged. But he was able to keep his hope alive because he had a deeper set of convictions about what's going on here beyond or at a deeper level than just the conflicts that we're seeing here and there, whether it's in Ukraine or in Rwanda or in Syria. But he could see something much, and he could appreciate that, and that was a spiritual part of his spirituality, it seems to me, that enabled him to keep going. So I would say that faith, not just as an set of ideas, but as a reality of the heart, was able to keep him moving, and that's part of the discernment that enabled him to move forward in a more positive way in the face of some pretty depressing situations. I don't know whether that's responding to your question or not, but anyway, I think we're at the end of our time. So I'm being given a signal in the back, from the back there, so that it's time for us to take a break. I think we come back at 2:50, is that correct? And so thanks everybody, and it's good to be with you.